families. Let's speak next this morning to Dr. Gillian Wright, who's a former palliative care doctor and campaigns for duty of care against assisted dying. Gillian, good morning. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, thanks.
What's the problem?
Well, I represent doctors and nurses across Scotland who are hugely concerned for people at the end of life and would have great sympathy for the suffering that we've heard described by families this morning. But we're really concerned and would oppose any move to introduce assisted suicide because of vulnerable groups particularly. So those who have had chronic mental health problems, those with learning disability, those maybe who are homeless, those who might feel a particular pressure to die, perhaps in coercive relationships. And we're really concerned that absolutely we need to hear the fact that people have had distressing deaths. But we are in a time of NHS crisis and we are not providing the right palliative care for people. And this would be the wrong response. It would be awful to have the means to give someone the way to end their life in 2 weeks, but yet not be providing them with palliative care, social care, psychological support, which is where we are in the NHS just now.
Right, let's just take one example you used there, Gillian. The legislation as proposed would only allow medical assistance to end life if the person had a terminal illness and had been ruled mentally fit to make the decision by 2 doctors. How does a homeless person then end up being classified as suitable to end their life on that basis?
I think what I meant was that there are particular groups when they are in that scenario that might be particularly vulnerable. So we know that homeless people who perhaps are socially vulnerable, maybe don't have extended family and support, maybe have had chronic addiction problems, might be particularly vulnerable if at the time of diagnosis of a terminal illness, somebody offered them an alternative. So we're just concerned that it's actually quite difficult sometimes to determine capacity. It's difficult to determine if someone's making a true choice. It's difficult to know if they're adjusting to their terminal diagnosis. It's difficult to know sometimes their prognosis. Absolutely, sometimes doctors get it absolutely right, but often they don't. And it's really important to know that there are real problems with assisted suicide itself. We know that about 7% of assisted deaths go wrong. Problems with seizures, some patients are sick, and some patients don't die. What do we do in those particular scenarios? It's actually... There are complications, unintended consequences that I am absolutely convinced those who are intending this legislation don't mean to bring. But there are implications for others, and that's for those who need to scrutinise law to take those on board.
What about pain in all of this? It's also difficult to classify pain, and you know that better than me as a former palliative care doctor. Many people have been asked by the GP on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the pain? When you get north of 10 with that, where do you go with this? The argument that people use is that if we have a sick animal, we take it to the vet, and the vet does their absolute best to save that animal. But when the pain and distress and suffering is too great for the animal to continue, there is end of life for the animal. Why are humans denied that?
Well, there are a number of aspects to that. So when you look in palliative care at pain, there are multiple aspects. So there are physical aspects which can be helped with morphine and other drugs, but you're absolutely right, there are limits of those. But there are new classes of analgesics that we need to learn more about. We need to have research.
But we've had listeners this morning saying their relatives died in pain. They died in agony. So that's not doing the job.
I know, and I think we know Marie Curie say that 1 in 4 patients don't get access to specialist palliative care. So for those who really need more than just a straightforward morphine driver. They do need to see a specialist team. But actually, there are other aspects to pain. There's psychological pain. One of your contributors talked about mental suffering, and when we talk about palliative care, we also need to involve psychologists, specialist nurses, social workers, because there are multiple aspects. And you may know that there's very, very few specialist palliative care psychologists in Scotland. I believe there's just two. There are fewer palliative care doctors in Scotland than there are MSPs.
Okay, how would that help? Sorry to interrupt you, but let me just read you a text. It's from Anne. In the last couple of years, I've watched two people I love die in dreadful pain, in one case slowly choking to death. This was despite palliative care, which had reached a point where nothing more could be done. I completely support assisted dying with the safeguards in place in the Scottish Bill. My friend, who could at this point no longer speak or move, was trying to pour liquid down his throat himself, and he ended up choking. This is inhuman. I would not let my dog go through that. What do you say to Anne?
Oh, it's just so hard to hear these stories, and I absolutely, and I do get that these are very difficult and sensitive situations that we need to think about. I think there's a real concern that if we allow two doctors to do this, with, for example, the MacArthur bill doesn't require there to be suffering present. There's no inclusion of suffering in the bill. It's just an autonomous choice. Then actually there are real concerns that there would be situations which would not be what would be intended by these families who are concerned, and there are disabled groups who are so concerned about this legislation because they hear people say, like we heard before, somebody sitting in a wheelchair, they shouldn't be allowed to go on like that. Well, they're so concerned that those kinds of perceptions of their quality of life, and actually they would be, COVID was a really salutary experience for many, because they realised that disabled communities were so disadvantaged and the resources were not allocated to disabled people. So there's implications for others, absolutely. So the law is there, absolutely, for individuals, but we need to protect those who are most vulnerable, and we need to. And with respect to animals, we know that some animals are put down because there's not enough money for their care, and we don't even fund palliative care completely by the NHS. We don't even have core palliative care services funded by the NHS. It's not that much of a priority for the state to provide it on the NHS. Okay. So we need to this needs a rethink. Absolutely, the status quo is not acceptable. None of us want to hear any stories of suffering like your listeners have described. We must listen to the public and the way they are telling us that things are broken. But what I would just counsel is just to so consider the difficulties we have. Look at other countries. Look at the Netherlands, where they euthanise babies on grounds of chronic disability. I mean, that's under ones with very severe chronic disabilities are euthanised.
But that's nowhere near what's being proposed here.
Absolutely, but that is if you permit these sorts of changes in the law, there's very few reasons on grounds of equality why should you not grant it for others. Okay. So, for example, Canada is a good example. It came in 2016 for those who were terminally ill, but it was challenged for those who were chronically ill, who said why was their suffering, their mental suffering, their physical suffering of any less value than those who are terminally ill. So it was extended in Canada within 5 years to include those with a chronic severe disability. And then it was extended further to include those with a chronic mental illness alone. So sole chronic mental illness has been approved in Canada for assisted suicide.
There are other countries where it has not been extended as well, Gillian, and there's no suggestion in the legislation that we've got here at the moment that we'd be anywhere like that space. But I take your point about it being potentially a slippery slope, as opponents of it say. Dr. Gillian Wright is a former palliative care doctor. She is a campaigner with duty of care. What do you